Welcome to Kentucky.
The birthplace of Abraham Lincoln and built on the largest cave system in the known world. The home of Daniel Boone, Hunter S. Thompson, horse racing, and bourbon.
That when the hour grows late, the Bluegrass state becomes the breeding ground for realms beyond those familiar to the human race. In the east, ghosts, spirits, and ethereal entities roam the hills and hollers.
In the north, Mothman beats his wings along the banks of the Ohio River.
To the west, small green creatures stalk farmhouses and disappear without a trace when shot.
While in the south, the energy of the Veiled Witch is palpable just over the border. Joining with us as we investigate just what goes wrong in the Bluegrass night.
And ask the question, how many coincidences are too many? There's no need to check the clock.
There's no need to check the clock. Time is an illusion.
Time is an illusion.
And it's midnight.
It's midnight. In Kentucky.
In Kentucky.
In Kentucky. In Kentucky. In Kentucky. In Kentucky. In Kentucky. Ladies and gentlemen, it is the midnight hour once again for Midnight in Kentucky. I'm Ben.
I'm Steven.
A lot of strange occurrences in this, the first month of 2020, from unknown drones flying over the central United States and many reports right here in the Bluegrass to the announcement of a new military branch known as the Space Force.
Yeah, what about that? The Space Force was, discussed during the Trump administration, I think last year, but then they signed the budget for it, for 2020, and we have seen this before. I think it was in the Unacknowledged documentary.
The documentary by, what is his name? Stephen Greer. Yeah. And you and I had talked a little bit about Unacknowledged on the first season of Midnight Kentucky. In the documentary Unacknowledged, it's at least proposed and theorized upon that there will be a false flag alien invasion propagated by some elements of the shadow government in a means to gain more control, gain more enhanced surveillance of the general population. And that this newly established branch of the military, which one could theorize is this Space Force, will directly do battle with these faux aliens, if you will.
And I'm like, is that where our current president got the idea from?
The whole thing is rather bizarre. Like the introduction of the idea of the Space Force up to its, coming about.
Yeah, and I guess, I say that kind of as a joke, but to start a whole new branch of the military, that isn't something that's just thought of and created overnight.
That hasn't happened since the Air Force in 47 with Roswell, right? 8 days after Roswell, the Air Force was established.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's a pretty unprecedented thing other than...
Right. And what was the release of the UFO videos from the Navy pilots?
Events of the same consequence, I guess. With Roswell, we had an alien spacecraft that had supposedly crashed. With this, we have the military saying, yeah, we know about these things and we've known about them for a while.
Right.
And all of a sudden we get a new branch of the military. That's a very good, I hadn't really thought about that yet.
And my wondering about this is, what is their function going to be?
I mean, they announced that yesterday, from the time of this recording, they announced that they showed off the new uniforms, right?
Right.
The uniforms are camouflage.
Yeah.
Which makes no sense for space, but they did say that these uniforms are, what was the words they used?
It was a budget issue.
Yeah. So they used old U.S. Army uniforms.
Right.
The members of the Space Force would be on the ground for the time being.
Right.
So, how are they Space Force if they're on the ground?
Right. I think there's plans probably to ramp up space exploration.
Right.
With Elon Musk's company, SpaceX, all these private companies getting into space. I think they're thinking ahead, militarize that, even with satellites and spying equipment. And who knows, even drones and spying satellites, that's going to be handled by this group, I feel like. But they never have really said exactly what they're going to be doing. I know there's a lot of jokes and memes about them fighting E.T.
Oh, yeah, and that's the whole thing. Has there been an official announcement of what the purpose of the Space Force is?
I have not, and I'm curious of when they're going to start handing out recruiting pamphlets.
Yeah.
Of what they're going to say.
And this is something we mentioned briefly before the show. How do they even establish who's going to join the Space Force? or who will join the Space Force.
What type of credentials would you need?
Yeah. And, all of this goes back to something that Tom DeLonge talked about. And I know Tom DeLonge is not the most credible source in any of this, or it doesn't seem like he is being made out to be the most credible source. I'm not sure if it was him or Louis Elizondo who said that they were working on a project to detect unidentified aerial phenomena as it was coming into the atmosphere of Earth.
Right.
The creation of the Space Force really brings me back to what they said about that.
I think that's what their function is going to be. And maybe they're going to have some type of manned station, something like the International Space Station, that will, attack these things that come into our atmosphere, which is probably not the best idea.
No. And it also seems like Robert Bigelow mentioned something about this as well from working on Skinwalker Ranch and how they were developing something that could detect these things as they were occurring. And that wasn't just UFOs. That was creatures and all of that showed up at Skinwalker.
Right. But then there's, I guess, speaking of those two companies, those are private industries that are for profit, that make money from our government doing things.
Right.
And, going out here on maybe a logical branch of thinking here is this is probably just the money grab for private corporations.
Sure. Completely. And I can't remember exactly who it was, but I think it was on Joe Rogan recently. They were talking about how SpaceX is an independent, space agency.
Yeah.
When in fact, it's not at all. They receive a large amount of money from government subsidy.
They do. Yes.
Yeah. So, that kind of brings it back to these private industries, just like Bigelow Aerospace. They factioned the Skinwalker Ranch investigation out to Bigelow Aerospace.
Right. This is probably just another branch of the military-industrial complex.
Right.
Such as Raytheon or Boeing or Lockheed Martin.
So these military, just like Bigelow Aerospace was contracted by a military branch to do research at Skinwalker, it makes you wonder how much Space Force is going to contract outside industries to do work with them, or if that will happen. I mean, I'm sure it will happen.
Yeah. Honestly, I'd like to know the list of companies they're working with, because I'd like to buy some stock in them.
Yeah, totally.
Be wise investment.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, for sure. But it does seem like something's happened. It's odd how this military branch just appeared, and we still don't really know exactly what they're going to be doing or what's happening with them, Right.
And it's going to be interesting to watch, because you think back to Unacknowledged about what the conspiracy was for the reasoning behind this.
Right.
And then you think, geez, is that what we're building up to?
It's definitely odd. And I've said this before. I don't know how much I buy into the theories behind Unacknowledged or behind the people that are presenting them, honestly. But it's very strange that, really Unacknowledged is what got us started on this. It reignited our, interest in this. And then Mirage Men. Actually, I think it was Mirage Men first, and then we watched Unacknowledged, and that kind of... So it's interesting that Unacknowledged appeared, 4, 5, 6 years ago?
Yeah.
And we are literally at the point now where we have the commercials from Unacknowledged for the Space Force or the space military agency playing out in real time on our TVs.
Right. And it's going to be interesting to see the recruiting offices popping up, around towns, and even the recruiters coming to high schools for the Space Force.
Yeah.
And honestly, they're probably going to grab a bunch of candidates to sign up and really may not know what they're signing up for.
Right. It's very strange. And like we said at the top of the show, it's just a strange time. It's almost like what we were talking about before the show started. We are at an age of awakening, and that sounds very new age and very occulty, and maybe it is. But a lot of things are happening right now that a lot of people are paying attention to, and then there's a lot of people that aren't paying attention to them.
Right.
But if you pay attention right now, there's things happening that confirm and validate what conspiracy theorists and, ufologists and just people in this field in general have talked about for years.
Yeah, and it's upon us. remember what we talked about in season 1, all the talk about on social media about dark days are coming.
Yes, completely. And I had almost completely forgotten about that. But yeah, for a long time there were multiple sources that were talking about dark days are about to descend upon us. And did we ever establish a connection between unacknowledged and that, or was that just a theory that we had that they may be connected?
I think it was a theory that they might be connected.
Right.
But since then, it seems like we have been propelled into many movements.
Completely.
Not just with the subject matter of our podcast, but other subject matters such as the Me Too movement.
Very much
we got this whole Epstein thing going on.
Very
we got
much
all these endless wars that keeps ramping up.
We have what's happening in Virginia at the time of this recording.
Exactly. And it seems like, we still have the mass surveillance state, which,
Completely.
Off subject here, but law enforcement is now utilizing a company, and I don't remember the name of the company, but they have been pulling everybody's images off of social media such as Facebook.
Oh, of course.
And all over the internet. They got over something way up in the billions of pictures and who you are. And now law enforcement has a AI, artificial intelligence database of facial recognition of when you're going down the street. It knows where they can scan you, and they know who you are and your complete background.
Well, that's absolutely terrifying.
Here's the terrifying thing is, I forgot which founder of Google mentioned this, but said if you don't have social media, this was years ago.
I remember this, yeah.
That, you may be thought of as some type of suspect of doing crime. You might need to be looked into.
Almost like how, if you were pulled over, in the 90s or 80s and you didn't have a license or a form of identification, that was thought of as weird.
Right.
Which it still is, but now it's if you don't have a social media account or...
Right. So you had to join that ranks, but now they have your face, and if you decided not to be on social media and have your picture on the internet, when your face is scanned by the AI system, it comes up unknown. I guarantee you they will discuss things with you.
Sure, yeah.
Because you will be suspect.
And, this all kind of goes back to the drones that we were talking about with Daniel Wilson and the cell towers that we talked about with Daniel. How, there's these fake cell towers that are going up for whatever purpose we don't know, but assumingly surveillance of some kind.
Yeah. And, we was discussing today before the podcast about John McAfee saying there is no security at all anymore because encryption is to protect from the man in the middle seeing the communications.
Right.
But when, I guess, whoever, this is paraphrasing Mr. Robot, but whoever is, in control of the exit nodes, the two endpoints, is in control of the data.
Well, that goes back to tactical skills. You never want to go out the same way you came in.
Right.
You know what I mean? Yeah, if you can keep from, if you've got that stream of information, then you own it all.
Right. And that's pretty much what the NSA, they've set up a bunch of shell companies that, they control the data. The cell companies, there's the FISA warrants that allows them to, everything on your cell phone goes to some system and they can, give it to whoever, and it's before the encryption really occurs. It's seeing it on the screen.
Right. It does certainly seem like the further we get down the road, the further that this surveillance amps up.
Right.
And the further that these measures are used to keep track of everybody,
Yeah. And who's to say, these surveillance programs are not going to tie into the Space Force somehow?
Completely. That's actually what I was about to say. We have these surveillance agencies these surveillance measures popping up. We have the Space Force coming up. And then we have, the unacknowledged theory of this false flag alien invasion that is going to take place. And it's going to be the Space Force agency that does battle with these evil aliens all Independence Day style. But, and in addition to the Dark Days thing, you remember those warning messages that were popping up on televisions, along with the Dark Days thing. Just what a time to be alive here in this new decade of ultra surveillance and ultra terrestrials and, all of the oddness that has come with the 2020s.
I believe the 1984 of Orwell is here.
Oh yeah, completely. Orwell's hell has come full force.
Yes.
We go from present conspiracies back to the past of the late 70s tonight, when we will be talking about two separate abduction experiences that occurred right here in Kentucky. One being one of the most famous abduction experiences on record. We'll be right back. Thanks for listening to Midnight Kentucky. So like I said before the break, we are going to be talking about two separate abductions that occurred in Kentucky in the month of January in 1976 and 1977. The first of these abductions is the Stanford abductions or the Liberty abductions. A lot of our information tonight comes from sites The Black Vault and the Appalachian Ghost Stories. And I know you've got a couple too.
Yes, from Mysterious Kentucky, Volume 1.
Yeah, Barton Earnley's book. Excellent compendium of knowledge.
Yeah.
Additionally, there's an excellent podcast called Our Strange Skies, hosted by Rob Christofferson. Rob did an episode on both these abductions in July 2018. That episode's called Minisode 6, Taken in Kentucky, the Abductions of Lee Parish, and the Stanford 3. And while I had heard of both of these abductions, this episode really cemented my interest in both of these cases. So I'll include that in the show notes. Be sure to give that a listen after listening to this episode. So I'm going to start out by telling the story, and then we'll give our brief synopsis, and then we will break these things down and talk about all the implications of these sightings. On January 6th, 1976, Mona Stafford's 36th birthday, she was joined by friends Elaine Thomas and Louise Smith for an impromptu celebration at the Redwood Restaurant located on US 27, south of Lancaster, 35 miles from Liberty, which was their hometown. Louise Smith is described as a tall, thin woman of 44 years who is widowed as a young woman, brought up her son and daughter by herself. She had 2 grandchildren and busies herself in spare time with painting and sketching and gospel singing. She performed around Casey County with the Jubilee Echoes, consisting of herself, a 14-year-old boy singer, and a bassist who is a lieutenant in Danville. She was a lifelong member of the Baptist Church and attends services regularly at Poplar Springs Baptist Church in Liberty. Mona Stafford is 35, the former owner of a arts and craft shop in Liberty, and currently unemployed except for secretarial work, which she does for her father, who owns a mobile trailer park. She was once married but has been divorced since 1970 and lives in a trailer home parked with her parents' home. She is a devout Christian, a member of the Hilltop Church of Christ near Liberty. Elaine Thomas is a 48-year-old housewife who has lived in Casey County, Kentucky all of her life. She and her husband Otis live several miles out of Liberty. They have a grown daughter and 3 grandchildren. Miss Thomas is also a lifelong churchgoer and is a member of the Contown Church of Christ. I bring all this information up because this is the actual information that appeared in the APRO News Bulletin to establish that these 3 women were upstanding community members and that they had no history of being liars or bending the truth or any history of events like these, for that matter. With a temperature of 38 degrees, a south wind of 15 miles per hour, and an overall visibility of 15 miles, the trio started the trip home from the Redwood restaurant south of Lancaster in Louise's 1967 Chevy Nova around 11:15. None of them had consumed any alcohol, and all 3 were in a good mood and looking forward to the pleasant drive. Driving on Highway 78 toward Liberty, a bright red object, which at first Mona believed to be an airplane crashing, was sighted following the car. It wouldn't be until Louise lost total control of the vehicle that the group would start to have second thoughts about what the object was. Reaching speeds exceeding 85 miles per hour, Smith cried out, "I can't hold the car on the road," at which point Mona reached over to take the wheel, believing something could be wrong with the steering, only to find she couldn't gain control of the vehicle either. Louise would later recall that her foot hadn't been on the gas pedal as the vehicle continued to accelerate. It would be then that the bright red object would grow exceedingly close to the Chevy Nova in a matter of seconds. The UFO flipped on its end and took a position extremely close to the driver's side window. The 3 women all reported the same thing, a gigantic, disc-shaped craft with a ring of red lights at its center and a blinking yellow light on its belly. The next thing the group felt was the car being pulled backwards, and also the feeling that they were going over speed bumps. Thomas began urging Louise to stop so that she could get a look at the object, but Mona and Louise were too terrified and couldn't stop the vehicle. Elaine had only had a glimpse of the object as it circled to their left and around behind them, and was later to comment about the object's beauty. "I can't describe it. I've never seen red that beautiful. I wanted to get out and look at it." Then, the women said, they saw a strange, wide, lighted road stretching as far as they could see ahead of them. At the same moment, Mona noted a red light come on the instrument panel that indicated the engine had stalled, despite the sensation that they were still moving very fast. After accompanying the vehicle in this manner for some time, the object quickly darted out in front of the car and illuminated the interior with a bluish-white light, which the craft shot out. Louise would describe the atmosphere as a hazy-like air, sort of like a fog. All 3 women experienced a burning sensation at this point, which rendered them unable to open their eyes. The last thing the trio recalled was being pulled into a pasture entrance in a crazy manner, as it was later described. What seemed like only seconds later, the trio found themselves back on the road and coming into Houstonville, 8 miles from their last experience with whatever the unknown craft was. They continued quietly on to Liberty. When they arrived home at Miss Smith's trailer, they all went inside. Miss Smith went to the bathroom, took off her glasses, and splashed water on her face, whereupon her hands and face began to burn with searing pain. All 3 had a red mark on the back of their necks, measuring about 3 inches long and 1 inch wide, with a clearly defined edges, giving them the appearance of a new burn before it blisters. Louise and Elaine's marks were centrally located between the base of their skulls and the top of their back, whereas Mona's was located to the left behind her ear. They could not account for the marks, which disappeared 2 days later. All 3 were experiencing burning and tearing of the eyes, but Mona Stafford had a much more severe case of conjunctivitis, an inflammation of the conjunctive membrane of the eyes, which was also present in encounters with the Mothman in Point Pleasant 10 years before. Prior to washing her hands, Louise taken off her watch and was startled to see that the hands of her watch were moving at an accelerated rate of speed the minute hand moving at the speed of the second hand and the hour hand moving also. Upon experiencing the pain of the water on her hands and face, she forgot about the phenomena of the watch and does not recall when it returned to normal or when she reset it. Concluding that something was wrong, the three ladies went next door to the home of Mr. Lowell Lee, who told what he had seen. He asked them to get into separate rooms and sketch the object, and when finished, he found the resulting sketches to be almost identical. Although all the women had trouble with their eyes, only Mona Stafford sought medical help, as her problem was so severe. The doctor who examined her found no explanation for the pain and tearing, but gave some eye drops which helped very little. Within a couple hundred yards of the abduction, one couple watched from the window of their home a large luminous object which passed over the Stanford area. This occurred around 11:30 p.m. The couple wanted to remain anonymous. Other observers reported also describing a ring of reddish-orange lights around a dish-shaped flying object. Two teenagers out for a joyride stated that they had chased a low-flying UFO after it had hovered over the Angel manufacturing plant in Stanford. They chased the strange object all the way to Danville, where they reported it to the police. Another very significant report came from the owner of the property where the three women's abduction took place. The former stated that, down the road from his house, he witnessed an unusually low-flying object which shot a white beam of light to the ground. Could this have been witnessing of the abduction itself? Although over 25 years have elapsed since the Stanford case, there has been not one negative comment on the details presented by any of the three women, and the Stanford abduction is still considered one of the best documented abduction cases. This particular case would be investigated by Dr. Jerry Black and Peggy Peggy Chanel of MUFON. All of the women had experienced significant weight loss, and Louise was having difficulty working at the Casey County Extension Office. Psychiatrist Leo Sprinkle of APRO would also join the investigation. Eventually, the three women would undergo hypnosis and polygraph testing. In his final report, Dr. Sprinkle had this to say of the event itself and the subsequent hypnosis sessions. Miss Smith suffered much as she relived the experience. The behaviors, e.g. weeping, moaning, tossing her head, shuddering and shaking, etc., were evident to those who observed her, especially as she seemed to relive an experience of a fluid material covering her face. Her smile, an evident relief in seeing the street light at the end of her hour and 1/2 loss of time experience, was dramatic and indicated that she was safe in the car once again and returning home with her friends. Sprinkle then goes on to recount Louise's claim that her pet parakeet, who according to her claims and the claims of others who observed the bird, refused to do anything with her after the UFO experience. Others could approach the bird, and it would not react wildly. However, when Louise came close to the bird would flutter and move away from her. The bird died within weeks of the UFO experience. Investigators also tried this with other birds to the same result. Mona Stafford responded well to the hypnotic suggestions, and she was able to describe impressions which led her to believe that she had been taken out of the car and that she was alone on a white table or bed. She saw a large eye which seemed to be observing her. She felt as if a bright white light was shining on her, and that there was a power or energy which transfixed her to the table or bed. She experienced a variety of physiological reactions, including impressions that her right arm was pinned or fastened, her leg left forced back behind her with pain to the ankle and foot, pressure on her fingers of the left hand as if they were forced to squeeze in some way, a feeling of being examined by 4 or 5 short humanoids who sat around in surgical masks and surgical garments while observing her. At one point, she sensed that she was either experiencing out-of-body travel or else she was waiting outside of a large room in which she could view another person, probably a woman, lying on the white bed or observation table. She perceived a long tunnel or a view of the sky as if she had been transported to an area inside a large mountain or volcano. Although she wept and moaned and experienced a great deal of fatigue as a result of the reliving of the experience, she felt better the next day. She expressed the belief to me that she now had a better understanding of what happened during this loss of time experience. Miss Thomas had been rather quiet during the initial interview in March of 1976, although it was obvious that she is perceptive and aware of other people's attitudes and feelings. Like the others, she has lost weight, but she has also experienced some personality changes. She dresses a bit more colorfully now, and she is willing to talk and to share her ideas with others. She too experienced a similar reaction during the hypnotic techniques. She apparently was responding well to suggestions to go deeper. When she relived the UFO experience, she experienced a great deal of emotional reaction. Her main impression that she was taken away from her two friends and that she was placed in a chamber with a window on the side. She seemed to recall figures which moved back and forth in front of the window of the chamber as if she were being observed. Her impression was that the observers were 4-foot-tall humanoids with dark eyes and gray skin. One disturbing aspect of the experience was the memory that she had some kind of contraption or covering that was placed around her neck whenever she tried to speak or think. The contraption or covering was tightened, and she experienced a choking sensation during these moments. At first, Miss Thomas interpreted the memories as indication that she was being choked by hands or that she was being prevented from calling out to her friends. Later, however, she came to the tentative conclusion that an experiment was being conducted and that the experiment was to learn more about her intellectual and emotional process. She recalled a bullet-shaped object about 1 1/2 inch in diameter being placed on her left chest. She previously had experienced pain and a red spot on that location. During the polygraph examination and during the initial hypnosis session, each witness was interviewed separately and from the other witnesses. After the initial description of the impressions, the women were invited to attend additional hypnosis sessions so that each woman could observe their reaction to the other two women. During these sessions, there was much emotional reaction which seemed to arise from two conditions: the compassion of the witnesses for their friend who was reliving the experience and releasing emotional reactions to the experience. Also, it seems as if the description by one witness would trigger a memory on the part of another witness, even if the experiences seemed to be similar or different. Certain similarities were observed, a feeling of anxiety on the part of each witness regarding a specific aspect of the experience. For Miss Smith, it was the wall and a gate beyond which she was afraid to move psychologically. For Miss Stanford, it was the eye, which she observed, and the impression that something evil or bad would be learned if she allowed the eye to control her. For Miss Thomas, it was the blackness, which seemed to be the feared condition or cause for anxiety. Each woman seemed to experience the impression that she had been taken out of the car and placed elsewhere without her friends and without verbal communication. For Miss Smith, the lack of verbal communication was most distressing, although she had the feeling of mental communication that she would be returned after the experiment. Differences were noted in that each woman seemed to have somewhat different kind of examination, and in a different location. Miss Smith did not have a clear impression of the location, although she did recall a feeling of lying down and being examined. Miss Stafford had the impression of being in a volcano or mountainside, with a room in which a bright light was shining on a white table with white-clothed persons or humanoids sitting around and observing her. Miss Thomas recalled impressions of being in a dark chamber with gray lights, permitting a view of humanoids who were apparently observing her. In the conclusion paragraphs, Dr. Sprinkle reports, "In my opinion, each woman is describing a real experience, and they are using their intelligence and perceptivity as accurately as possible in order to describe the impressions which they were obtained during hypnotic regression sessions. Although there is uncertainty about their impressions, especially in regard to how each person could be transported out of the car and relocated to the car, impressions during the loss of time experience are similar to those of other UFO witnesses who apparently have experienced an abduction and examination during their UFO sighting. Although it is not possible to claim absolutely that a physical examination and abduction has taken place, I believe that the tentative hypothesis of abduction and examination is the best hypothesis to explain the apparent loss of time. The apparent physical and emotional reactions of the witnesses to the UFO sighting, the anxiety and reactions to the witnesses to their experience which have occurred after their UFO sighting. An interesting subsequent event is the concern of the women that were re-experiencing the physical symptoms which they had experienced for several days following the January 1976 sightings. When I called them on July 26, the woman said that they were re-experiencing some of these same kinds of symptoms, e.g. fatigue, listlessness, sensitivity to skin, a burning feeling on the face and eyes, and fluid discharge. I tried to reassure the ladies that it was not an uncommon experience in hypnotic regressions that a person, after reliving earlier emotional experiences, may experience some of the symptoms which accompany them in emotional reactions. In my opinion, the UFO experiences of these women are a good example of the type of apparent abductions and examination which seems to be occurring to more UFO witnesses. I believe that the investigation could be continued with the hopes of obtaining further information about their experiences. However, the present evidence suggests to me that the women have cooperated sincerely and openly in describing their reactions to their UFO sighting and loss of time experience, and the polygraph examination and hypnotic regression sessions have been useful in uncovering their impressions of the UFO sighting and subsequent events. I believe the case is a good example of UFO experiences because of the number of character witnesses and because of the result of further investigation through polygraph examinations and hypnotic regression sessions. Now, this is the initial event, but it's pertinent to say that all of these women had subsequent odd things that happened to them. The most impressive of these being that in the fall of that year, Louise Smith was overcome by an inexplicable urge to go back to the scene of the original sighting. On August 1st, she did return, got out of her car, and heard the words, "Feel of your hands." When she did so, she realized that 3 rings, which she habitually wore, a small gold ring, a pearl ring, and a gold ring with an onyx and small diamond, were gone. On the 26th of September, Miss Smith walked out onto the stoop of her trailer home and found her onyx and diamond ring lying there. For some inexplicable reason, she scooped up the ring, walked to the creek which runs by her home, and threw it into the water. And thus ends the Stanford and Liberty abductions. And that was all very, very long-winded, but I felt like we had to include that information because that, not only is this one of the, most impressive UFO abduction cases on record, there are many strange things that don't get talked about a lot when you're initially just hearing about this.
Right. There's a lot of minor details, just like what you mentioned about the rings.
Yeah. I had never heard that before until I was researching this today for this episode.
Yeah, I have not heard of that either, and I've looked into this, a lot myself.
Several times, yeah. Both of us have.
Yeah.
So does Barton go into any more? Does he mention any other things?
There's only one thing that sticks in my mind that he mentions is like the exact location, and This is on Highway 78. It's between the junctions of 1194 and 198, which is a small stretch of road. I pulled it up on Google Maps and even kind of put it into like a little database thing we're working on.
Yeah, we've been working on a database of unexplained and unknown encounters in Kentucky. Well, Steven's been working on this. Hopefully we're going to have that up at some point in the future for people to check out.
Hopefully middle of this year we'll have a beta up.
That would be awesome. So keep an eye out for that. But anyway.
Yeah. So this is a very small stretch of road. I pulled it up and looked at it, and it's and of course the landscape probably has changed since 76.
Sure.
But there's still nothing out there. There's nothing but open fields, farmland, middle of nowhere. Very small stretch of road there. So it's pretty easy to pinpoint this is where it happened.
Right.
It's interesting, and I think, for these ladies, for me, when you was reading this, a lot of similarities to what happened to Calvin Parker.
Very much so.
Even down to the description of an eye, being on the table and the eye, examining them.
Yes. And when I was reading through this, that was one of the things that really stuck out to me is the fact that this abduction very closely mirrors Calvin Parker's abduction. And
it's in the same decade. His was in 73.
Right.
Hers was in 76.
Yeah. And, it's odd how abductions work because it seems like there's certain things that occur in certain decades. And this one almost, with the exception of some of the things that they talk about, the initial experience of the UFO and of how it, overtook the car and all of that, very similar to what Calvin talked about when we talked with him.
Yeah, and even down to the descriptions of like the beings that abducted them, the way they were abducted, the missing time.
Right.
And you're right, it seems like these things take like in decades of way they were abducted and what they experienced.
Right.
And it's kind of interesting. It's almost like these beings of whatever are doing this, their technology improves just like our technology improves.
Right, exactly. And honestly, that's something that's talked about a lot throughout the UFO phenomenon, about how, in the 1800s, people were seeing airships and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. Stuff that didn't exist at the time, but would come to exist, 100 years later. Right. And in the 40s, we were getting rocket-propelled UFOs and UFOs, stuff that we were only really starting to toy with scientifically at that time. Now we are seeing, UFOs that travel interdimensionally, for lack of a better terminology for it.
Yeah, they kind of come and go in and out of our reality.
Right. My biggest standout to me was the fact that, and this is something we'll talk about again in the Paris abductions, but the conjunctivitis that these women experienced after this event, that is, every single witness, and I know we talk about the Mothman a lot on here, but every single witness of the Mothman phenomena reported that conjunctivitis.
Yes.
And there are several UFO witnesses who have reported that same conjunctivitis.
And that seems to be a well-documented similarity to all these cases.
Yeah. The conjunctivitis is definitely, there's something going on with that. I don't know if it's the fact that they're, like they reported, if it's that burning atmosphere that these things seem to bring about when they hit you with those beams, or I don't know, or if it's, literally seeing something that you're not supposed to, or that you're not capable of seeing, that your brain can't I don't know. It kind of reminds me of, and of course it's not this drastic, but it reminds me of Indiana Jones and the first one, where, he tells her not to look at the Ark of the Covenant.
Right.
And all those Nazis get their faces melted because they were trying to open it up and attain its power.
Right.
Like, is that kind of the same thing that's happening here? Is it,
Well, if you think about a certain story in the Bible where Lot's wife turned around
and turned to a pillar of salt.
Yeah,
right.
And she melted.
Right.
So to speak.
Both of these abductions that we're talking about tonight, especially, this later one that we'll get to here in just a second, they seem to indicate that something is occurring with physical reality. For a long time we felt like these were extraterrestrial beings that were taking us and doing experiments on us, but any investigator currently has to realize that something far stranger than just an extraterrestrial presence is happening. So, I often liken, and some of our listeners may not dig this, but I often liken UFO experiences to godly experiences or miracles.
Yeah.
And that's very similar. When Lot's wife turned around and saw this, presence of God, she melted into a pillar of salt. When the Ark of the Covenant was opened and, it messed people up. This is almost the same thing on a less drastic scale.
Right. And it also seems to be a trickster. As far
Very much so.
Just like her missing rings. It was almost playing a trick on her.
Right.
And this seems to be, documented in some other cases as well, even out of Skinwalker Ranch.
Very much so. The trickster element in Skinwalker Ranch, there's the story of the bulls and his prize bulls getting moved from the pasture to the abandoned trailer and him wondering what happened to them. The trickster plays in a lot in these things.
Yeah.
Another interesting part of this case was the investigator who initially came from APRO, and whose breakdown of the case I read there at the end, Leo Sprinkle. Listeners may remember, or, just followers of the UFO phenomenon in general, may remember that Leo Sprinkle was the investigator that went to meet with Paul Benowitz when Paul Benowitz was having his UFO encounters out at Kirkland Air Force Base. That whole case is documented in a documentary called Mirage Men, which we've talked about many times, and actually did an entire episode in season 1. Season 1 may come back as our Patreon gets launched, so we can bring those episodes to you guys. But, I thought it was interesting that Leo Sprinkle played a role in both the Mirage Men affair and the Stanford and Liberty abductions.
Yeah, he kind of went from, something that was made a documentary about to this Stanford abduction case that is widely known, but not that widely known. It's not like, the case of Calvin Parker.
Right.
Or even the fire in the sky incident.
Right. And even though it is one of the best documented cases of alien abduction, you're right. It's far less known than the Travis Walton's abduction or Calvin Parker's and it's odd that Mirage Men, the events that happened with Paul Benowitz, kind of the same thing. It's known in members of the UFO community, but it's far less known than, if you were to mention Travis Walton or, to a casual person who is interested in ufology.
Right.
So we go from early January of 1976 to January 27th of the following year, 1977, what has become known as the Prospect, Kentucky Abduction of Lee Parish. Thank you for listening to Midnight Kentucky. We'll be right back.
In the stillness of the night, I hear my heart beat. A single thought inside my head that just keeps repeating. Like the memories of hearing an old forgotten song, a beautiful lyric of the changes of the years long gone. Well, I fought the fight and I felt the light and I know just how it feels to lose the one inside of you and to hold on to they can't steal. The weight of these nightmares was so tight around my feet. Cut clean now are the ropes my lungs begin to breathe. Every circle this rock makes is one less that you have. So live with purpose, live with love, and make somebody laugh. Well, I fought the fight and I felt the light and I know just how it feels to lose the one inside of you and to hold on to they can't steal. Depression no longer leads me down the roads I travel home. So many songs left for me to write and dreams for me to love. The seas always have the storms, white caps for me to brave. I'll take them all on one by one just to hear you call my name. Well, I fought the fight and I felt the light and I know just how it feels to lose the one inside of you and to hold on to they can't steal. Never lose the one inside of you and hold on to they can't steal.
Welcome back to Midnight in Kentucky. Next we are going to talk about the abduction of Lee Parish, which occurred on January 27th, 1977, just a year and 20 days after the Liberty abductions. This case, though popular amongst UFO circles, and especially in high strangeness circles, is far less documented than the Stanford and Liberty abductions. And it seems somewhat less investigated. And that's no diss on the investigators who did take part in it, but it seems like there was less interest in this case, and that may be because of the just supreme strangeness of what happened to Lee Parish. The majority of our information on this comes from a website called Think About It Docs, and all these websites, of course, we'll put in the show notes. But I'm going to read the original APRO bulletin that this was reported in. It was written by Carlo Rucari, who was one of the investigators who went out to investigate this case, a member of APRO. This was published in the APRO Bulletin, volume number 25, number 7, in January of 1977. This is the full report. Source, Carlo Rucari, APRO Bulletin, volume 25, number 7. Investigators, Don Elkins and Carlo Ruckert. Percipient, Lee Parish. Date of sighting, 1/27/77 at 1:05 a.m. Duration, 35 minutes. On January 27, 1977, Don and I were contacted by Lawrence Allison, a hypnotist who has worked with us before on UFO-related cases. Miss Parish, Lee's mother, had called Larry because she felt something unusual had happened to her son the previous night. Lee and his friend, Kathy Johnson, met with Larry and Don and I at Larry's house that evening. Lee Parish is 19, a high school graduate, employed by his family's firm Parish Supply as a truck driver and all-around worker. He is a husky 6-footer with a quite polite manner. He seemed to us to be of average intelligence, a common-sense type who was genuinely bothered by what had happened to him. His appearance was very neat, his dress casual. Lee had been at Kathy's house and left just as a television program they had been watching was going off the air, which pinpointed his departure at just before 1 a.m. He fed the dog on the way out and then got in his Jeepster, a 1970 model with a V6 engine, and headed home, normally a 7-minute journey. The weather was cold and partly cloudy, with quite a bit of snow on the ground. However, the roads were relatively clear and there was no precipitation. He was driving west on Highway 329, heading toward US 42 and perhaps 4 miles short of it, when he saw an object. Lee first saw the object hovering just over the tree line, between 100 and 220 feet off the road, at an altitude of 100 to 100 feet. The object appeared to be about 10 feet tall and 40 feet long. Its shape appeared perfectly rectangular. The craft was the color of the setting sun, but much brighter. Lee first thought the object were the trees on fire in front of him, until noticing that it was hovering just over the tree line, between 100 and 200 feet off the road and at an altitude of 100 to 150 feet. The object appeared to be about 10 feet tall and 40 feet long. Its shape appeared perfectly rectangular. The craft was the color of the setting sun, but much brighter. Lee felt a compulsion to look at it, and was unable to remove his gaze from it. But at the same time, it was too bright to look at continually. He became very frightened and wanted to leave the area, but couldn't do it. He doesn't even remember how the car managed to stay on the road. He wasn't driving. About 15 seconds into the sighting, the car radio failed. He continued watching the fire-colored UFO. It hovered until he was directly underneath it. Then suddenly, it sped away. First at the speed of a jet, then very quickly to the northwest. It had never made any sound. When Lee arrived home, his mother met him at the door and said, "What's wrong with your eyes?" Lee looked at the mirror and saw that the whites were entirely bloodshot. There was considerable pain which continued, though to a lesser degree. That evening, he noticed the time was around 1:45, which meant that he'd been en route from Kathy's house for 45 minutes on a 7-minute trip. His mother confirmed his arrival time home, and his girlfriend confirms his departure time from her house. Lee was somewhat anxious concerning his being a hypnotic subject, and so Don and Larry spent some time talking to him about hypnotic techniques and what he would be experiencing in mental states. Lee felt much reassured when he found out that he would not be unable to control what happened to him, that he could ask to come out of hypnosis at any time, and that the hypnotist would not be tricking him as he had seen done at a party. After this discussion, he agreed to hit the hypnotic session, for he expressed a great deal of desire to find out what had happened to him during that missing time. Larry spent perhaps 40 minutes relaxing him, achieving the desired hypnotic state and regressing Lee back to several childhood ages. Then he brought Lee to the time of the sighting experience, told him to speak up without prompting, and just let him tell the story as it was happening to him. It was quite eerie for this observer to go through this extremely unusual sequence of events with Lee. Here is the story as told under hypnosis. After he left Kathy's house, he saw the rectangular UFO at first and thought it was a fire, but he immediately rejected that hypothesis and became very scared, asking himself over and over, "What is it?" His eyes hurt from looking at the bright red object, but he couldn't look away. Somehow, it was not moving, but it arrived at a position directly overhead. During this period, he cannot remember driving the car, so it is unknown whether the craft had actually moved over the road or whether the car had entered the field, part of the flat land over which the UFO was hovering. He was increasingly frightened and kept repeating, "It's not moving," in a puzzled, frightened tone. Then, suddenly, he could not see anything. A split second before that, the craft had changed color to black, then to white. Then he could see nothing and felt something in his eyes. When he could see again, he was no longer in the Jeep, but in a circular, all-white room. He had no knowledge of the transition. The room was about 20 feet in diameter, with a ceiling of about 20 feet high, although from the outside the ship had not looked nearly that high. The walls of the room were self-luminous. Before him stood three objects which he instinctively felt or sensed were sentient beings, although they were definitely not human. A black one, a red one, and a white one. The black one was on his left. It stood as high as the ceiling and was roughly the shape of an army silhouette target, jug-shaped with a relatively small head. It had a flat bottom and one arm, a handless one-joint appendage. The arm was rough-skinned, the rest of the entity rough in patches, smooth in patches. The head was featureless. It moved slowly and touched him on the left side of his back, hurting him quite a bit and terrifying him through the regression. Lee kept repeating, "No, no, not the black one." The sensation of the black one touching him was somehow cold and burning at the same time, and he felt as though he were vibrating. The red one was on his right. It was about Lee's size or a little smaller and rectangular in shape, like a Coke machine. It had one arm, or probe, unjointed and handless. Lee felt that the thing was scared and reluctant to touch him, but it too came slowly over and touched him on the shoulder and on the right temple, above the ear and within the hairline. This felt like a needle and stung briefly, but did not terrify Lee and did not hurt long. During this time, Lee felt quite cold. The whole ship seemed to be rocking back and forth like a boat on the water. The white one was about 6 feet tall, Lee's height. It sat in the middle of the room, watching Lee. Its body was solid and blocky and its head square on the sides, quite flat in front. In profile, the head sloped toward the body at a 45-degree angle with no features. The whole being glowed. It had arms but did not use them, remaining stationary. Lee knew that it was the ruler of the other two. The red one backed up, and after it had touched Lee and went together with the white one, either merging with it or going behind it, in which case Lee could not see it. Since it was smaller than the white one, the red one had done its job, and the white one started making a sound which Lee described as that of a person brushing his teeth or using sandpaper, a rhythmic scraping sound. The black one was backing up slowly at this point also. Lee had been quite cold, found that he was now warm. Then the white one moved to the back one and either merged with it and went behind it, leaving only a 20-foot tall black one there with Lee. The black one simply disappeared and Lee was alone in the white room. He noticed that, perhaps due to the bouncing and rocking motion of the ship, he felt quite a bit heavier. Under hypnosis, there was no transition between his presence in the white room and his awareness of being back in the Jeepster. "There's the pond," he said, and went on to describe getting home, his eyes burning, his fright, and his mother's comments on his eyes. His sleep that night was poor, but not because of dreams. His eyes simply hurt a good deal, and they were still hurting at the session that night whenever he closed them. Lee never used the word telepathy to explain how he knew what he knew about the machine-like beings, for he knew quite a bit, that they were sentient, that the red one was scared, that the white one was the leader, and that it was thinking about him. When asked what he thought their purpose was in taking him on board, he replied that he felt they were checking out his chemical makeup and doing a physical checkup. They were curious about the way Lee was Lee. He felt, too, that they would be contacting him again. The investigators were interested in the mechanism by which Lee was taken from and returned to the Jeepster, and so we asked him very carefully about the method of transport. Lee said the red ship had caught the Jeep as he went underneath it, just like a mousetrap waiting for a mouse. The Jeep was not on the ship, not on the ground, suspended by some force. Lee was transformed into and out of the ship without opening the door of the Jeep. When they put him back in the Jeep, it was still suspended. Then he was back on the road, and Lee saw the UFO departing. The radio continued not to work for an approximate 5 seconds it took the ship to disappear from Lee's view. Somehow, during the process, Lee's cigarette, which he was smoking when he first sighted the UFO, vanished completely. Lee felt that they, whoever they were, had a sort of control over both him and the Jeep from the time he saw the UFO until he left. as he was never able to get away from the craft or move of his own volition while on the ship. Interestingly enough, the electrical system of the Jeep went bad the day after the sighting and will need quite a bit of repair work. There are 2 power lines which run along Route 329, the utility line and telephone lines. The only body of water close by is a small pond. The land is flat farmland, the neighborhood quite rural. After Lee was awakened from his hypnotic state, having been told he would remember everything very clearly, he asked him again about how the UFO had first come into his line of vision. To his best of ability, he can only determine that it materialized out of thin air, as the fields around him are flat, with no hills to hide behind. When he first saw it, it was over a tree line. Dr. Burton Monroe, consultant to APRO in zoology, lives in Anchorage, Kentucky, a suburb community about 4 miles from the abduction site. He reported to us that at about 10:30 on the same evening, January 26th, a neighbor of his had heard her children screaming, run to her window, and seen a large white-shaped disc object with a dome. Lee said that he had always been fairly interested in UFOs, and when he was in high school had read at least one book called He Thought UFO. He was interested in psychic phenomena and had previously had some peculiar things happen to him. He told of willing an outdoor light to go on. It was unplugged at the time, but mysteriously came on anyway. This incident was attested to by Kathy. Lee said he had seen UFOs several times prior to the January 27th sighting, but he was always with someone, and he felt that they had wanted only him, and had known that he was alone that Wednesday night, and so chose that night to take him on board. Lee's mother had also seen several UFOs. Perhaps her most vivid sighting was of a nocturnal light that appeared behind the house, making a noise like a sewing machine going full throttle. And thus ends the saga of the Lee Parish abduction.
Very interesting.
Yeah, there's a lot of things to unpack there that you and I have talked about several times on the show.
Yeah, and there's so many similarities to other things.
Yes, very much so.
For instance, the black being our thing that was in the ship with him.
They describe them as geographic shapes.
Yeah. That almost sounds like what Calvin described as a robot, that when he grabbed the other being and was kind of roughing it up, it come and then restrained him and subdued him. And even he said it vibrated, just like
this. He did. I could have completely forgotten about Calvin saying that it had vibrated as well.
While you was reading that, I pictured the same thing in my mind that Calvin was describing his experience. That was exactly what I was seeing, and he described it almost very similar, if not
very
identical.
Similar, right?
Another thing is, same thing as the Liberty abductions, the car not having control.
He lost control.
Yeah,
he lost control of the car. He had the conjunctivitis, same as the Liberty and Stanford abductions. Very similar. Very similar.
And then about the trees being on fire.
Yes, I was hoping you would get there.
I caught that one right off, and that's the same thing we've discussed about the one that was reported by the sheriff's deputy, James Bunch.
Right, almost identically. They, at the beginning of that encounter, he believed it was the trees on fire.
Yeah.
Not only that, but these red-orange UFOs that are being cited, that were cited by several in Lee Parish's case, and were cited by several over in Casey County in the Liberty abductions, directly mirror what not only James Bunch talks about in his encounter, but what you and Daniel and I talked about when we talked with him about his encounters. These gigantic red lights.
Exactly. It's almost identical to all the other stories we've been hearing, and these go back, to the 70s.
Yeah, totally.
And we describe
if not before.
Right. Before. I mean, I'm sure it's happened before. People just didn't talk about it. An interesting story that I ran across, Bridget and I think I texted to you about the comedian Hal Sparks.
Yes, yeah.
He was on Famously Afraid, and for you all who
this was almost exactly the same craft. Go ahead, I'm sorry, but you're right. That was almost exactly the same thing.
Right, and he's a comedian. He grew up in Kentucky, but now he's out in L.A. doing his comedian and his band stuff. But went back in the 70s again. Him and his friends, he was just a kid. And him and his friends were, up late at night playing video games, watching TV, or whatever kids did back then.
Right.
There wasn't no YouTube or anything around. And then they seen a craft. They went outside, checked it out. They had missing time. They woke up. They was asleep inside the house. Years went on, and he brought this up to his grandma. And his grandma was like, "Oh, your granddad wouldn't like these stories about these aliens. He didn't like them. And then as he got to, discussing with his family and stuff as the show went on, I don't want to, spoiler alert, I guess.
I will link some show notes to this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He pretty much made out like his family lineage, his dad and his grandfather both were abducted, and this was all like during, throughout their life.
Which is something we see a lot, the lineage of abduction.
Yeah, which was in Peaks Mill, Kentucky.
Where exactly is Peaks Mill?
It's in part of northern Kentucky. Looks like it is in. Peaks Mill, Kentucky is north of Frankfort, which is in between Lexington and Louisville. So it looks like it's, probably within an hour and a half of Prospect, Kentucky.
Right. And of course, all these things are, located within decent distance from each other, being in Kentucky. And it seems like these red-orange lights, it's like at this point, I feel like we can establish a connection between these red-orange lights and taking people in Kentucky.
Yes. I think there's definitely a correspondence there. And then we even have what's called the Sand Hill lights up in Mount Sterling.
Yes, I was hoping you would bring that up too. Good catch, man. Okay, so we talked about the Sand Hill lights on a previous episode, the return of the Kentucky cryptids being linked with the creature that's been called the Barilla or the Gateway Werewolf.
Right.
Yeah.
It seems like all these mysterious things that goes on in Kentucky ties in, and they all have similarities. Maybe not these abductions have similarities to, the cryptids.
Right.
But the cryptids have similarities to UFO sightings, which have similarities to the abductions. And all of it ties together loosely. I mean, I guess you have to draw lines to it, but they all have similarities as far as there's one or two things in each story that's similar.
That link. And not to criticize anything like this, but is that not how history works? Is that not how we examine historical texts? Like, we look for historical texts that complement one another.
Oh, the entire religious basis.
Go ahead and say
it. We might not want to put that in there.
Yeah, but that's where I was going to.
Yeah. But yes, history is connected by loose facts.
Right. And the investigative skills of historians or archaeologists to take one text and compare it to another. So, I mean, that's exactly what we're doing here. These events coincide. These reports of cryptids coincide with these reports of the same craft or lights that are seen in these abduction cases.
Yeah. I mean, I guess you could say that the stories of Jesus and Buddha are similar, have a lot of similarities. They were not the same person.
Very much so.
But they both shared similar experiences, what is documented in separate pieces of history that was found on way different regions of the globe.
Completely. And there's tons of historical accounts very similar to that. So in addition to all of that, when I was doing research for this case, I typed in geometric shaped entities. And immediately, this post from just the other day, from Friday, January 17th, 2020, and is described as, the heading on this is, Terrifying Geometric Shaped Humanoid in Northern California. I mean, it's not exactly what Lee Parish describes, but it's close enough there. I'm looking at a photo here. It's got the bulbous head on it. It's got the appendage-like arms on it. Almost, not exactly.
Yeah.
Lee described geometric shapes in general. This thing is more humanoid with geometric shapes around it, but close enough to be like, there's the same thing. It's that comparison there.
It's the comparison, and, everybody who sees something, they have a different viewpoint of it or how they perceive it.
Perception.
Exactly. Perception is the word I'm looking for. They have a perception of what they're seeing. And just like, the way I imagined it when Calvin Parker was telling his story, I perceived it a certain way. And then when I heard this story, I was like, this is identical to what Calvin Parker was describing and identical to what's in that picture.
Right. And I'll put this story in the show notes. But speaking of perception, I feel like that perception, or at least my final thoughts on this matter, are going to come back to those matters of perception a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the perception way things are perceived definitely seems to tie all these things together.
Completely. Let's take our final break. We'll be right back with our final thoughts. Thanks for listening to Midnight Kentucky.
For one of you guys, man, I got a little something. All fighters, all rhymers, all writers, all comers. I've been stockpiling raps, running up on the numbers, and what I'm getting back ain't what I expected from you. So if it's gonna go like that, it's gonna be like this. I ain't never been the type to run you down in a diss. Instead, I gun you down by the side of the road, leave you screaming, bleeding, freezing in the cold all alone. There were a couple of guys who were up to no good and started making trouble in my neighborhood. So I got my 9 and I hit the streets in the lateness of the hour when the vine starts to creep.
Here's a little story how they all got scared as soon as I started popping shots in the air. And I didn't have to blast them, but I did anyway. Ain't that just the American way? Ain't that just America these days? Ain't that just America always? I walk with a gun limp, they call me John Wayne. They're my brothers in a bloodbath, I'm a modern day Cain. This piece right here, what keeps me able to attain peace and then keep it stable. To run this full plate race in my place at the table. Say grace over enemy graves, you know I'm grateful. I survived, Lord bless the dead. He took some bad advice and it went straight to his head. Somebody told him he ought to come after the best. They slept on me, now I provide eternal rest. Here I am with my soul aching. I stand with my back breaking. While you were sleeping, I stayed awake and I came up with a plan. Here I am with my hope fading. I stand with my face shaking, but I know there's something big awaiting. I am more than just a man. Here I am with my war waging. I stand with my blank slate. If you think you know, then you're mistaken. Gonna know just who I am. Now that I got your attention, was your ignorance bliss? Now that you're on the defensive, you wish I didn't exist. Now that your thoughts are getting pensive and the tension is thick. Now that my very existence too much for you to deal with. An atmosphere of apprehension and I know you feel it. Aesthetic follows function, emotional content. What was that, an exhibition? Come on, I'll give you a glimpse. The streets was waiting on something, I delivered on this. This is all just an illusion. Only static broadcasting on a screen to call us in to stay looped in. This is all just an illusion. An open slate of time and space blank where energy never ends or begins. The whole world is a stage and living well is an art. The moral of the story's ending always relies on the start. So be careful where you bind and to which you're apart. You gotta try to find the balance between your brains and your heart. When you're fighting to make it, always beware what it makes you. We make our roads for walking them, so be aware where they take you. Take your time and change the world. Don't let the world change you, but the change is gonna come, so may your aim always stay true. There is magic in the moment, demons lurking to tell, and divisions become dualities the deeper you delve down beneath the surface where the serpents all dwell. Skeptical, they don't see what this vision entails, so you gotta show it to them, gotta open their eyes up, gotta give them the knowledge and then hope that they wise up. You can lead a horse to water and then beat it to death, but then you're lost in the wilderness walking back by yourself. So while they're racing to the bottom, we'll be making their power moves. To truly be victorious, you must first have learned how to lose. Everything is a sacrifice, everything in this has a price. Meditate on this mantra as I move through my mind at night. Out here in the ether where it's either us or our ego. Existence exaggerate, these aren't the waters that we know. Out past the places where they say that we should go. Everything above a reflection of what is happening below. It's here that you'll discover what you've known all along. That death is to life as change is in a song. That love is to life as flesh is to the bone. That bone is to blood as ego is to the soul. So embrace, do not engage, let go to hold on. Everything has its time to beat, just goes on. Embrace, do not engage, let go to hold on. Everything has its time to beat, just goes on.
Welcome back to Midnight Kentucky. Tonight we have talked about the Stanford and Liberty abductions and Lee Parish's abduction from Prospect, Kentucky. Two of the most prominent alien abduction experiences in Kentucky, both of which occurred this month. Stanford abduction on the 6th of January, Lee Parish's abduction on the 27th of January. Both very well documented alien abductions. Lee Parish is a little less so, I think, because of the just supreme strangeness of the whole encounter. But even in the Stanford abductions, we don't hear about those stranger things that happened with them in the general rundown, like the rings, like you were talking about.
Right. And those are kind of I think those get lost in the big story, the small details. And to me, that's what I like to focus on, is the small little details, because those have a story within themselves.
Right, absolutely. And honestly, that's why I read those little character profiles of the three women at the top of the show, just because, being from around here and being, just knowing these, being from this area of Kentucky, you get a really good idea of what these people, who these people were and what they would have been into.
Yeah, and I mean, Liberty is, a whole 10 minutes from where we're located currently?
Not very far at all. As a matter of fact, if we want to link this back in, on the Return of the Kentucky Cryptids episode, we talked about a series of critter sightings in Liberty, and Bigfoot sightings in Casey County. Several, as a matter of fact. Not too far at all from where this abduction occurred.
No, but that whole area, as you start branching out Kentucky, and the database is going to help show this.
Yeah, totally.
Once, we've looked at it, and once you start putting these things together, you're like, well, this one's not too far from this one, but this one isn't too far from that one, and then look over here, there's one right next to this one, and next thing you know, there's this whole map that just connects all these little things throughout Kentucky.
Completely.
These patterns that you start seeing, and be like, wow.
Totally, and, it's like we've said before, if we were to ever expand that map, it would probably link with all sorts of things in Ohio, and then Tennessee, and then Indiana, and all those things would link with, Illinois and Michigan and...
Right, it would go over the entire United States, if not, the globe.
Right.
Because, we're a small place in the world, especially Liberty, Kentucky.
Sure.
And I have to wonder how many people who has experienced this has forgot about it, kind of like Hal Sparks. He kind of put it in the back of his mind and then let it go until he got older, and then had kind of like a flashback memory. A lot of people probably suppress it. Sure.
And that's kind of what we were talking about before we even started the show. Many people who have encounters like this, it's almost like you get the volume turned down on them. And, another podcaster who does Air Strange Skies talks about an event he had, where he, he's always been interested in UFOs, but he saw a UFO across from his house, stood out there for 15 minutes, went back inside. And, there's something about these things that when you actually see them, you're just like, whatever.
Right. It's kind of like, as you said, the volume gets turned down, and then it just becomes a normal part of life.
Right.
And there we enter in what we talked about at the first of the show, the Space Force.
Yes. Yeah.
All of these things are just going to become a normal part of life.
If you had talked about the Space Force in 1999, that was an idea for science fiction. You know what I mean?
Right. If you'd have talked about how you're hearing our voices right now and the technology in that in 1999, you would have thought you were crazy.
Sure. And it's like we said, conspiracy theorists, and I almost hate using that word as much as I hate using the word alien anymore, because it implies, like I said, like I mentioned earlier in the episode, any real researcher that's paying attention knows at this point that these things are not extraterrestrial, or at least not solely extraterrestrial. These are not things that are coming from another planet. It's something far, far weirder. But all you ever see on TV and in documentaries, the televised ones, Ancient Aliens, for instance, is, it's extraterrestrial, it's extraterrestrial, it's extraterrestrial. Well, it's not. Or at least, the investigations that you and I have been on, or that we've looked into, kind of prove to me that it's not solely extraterrestrial, if it's extraterrestrial at all. It's the same thing with using that conspiracy theorist term. The term has become so bogged down with implications that you almost don't even want to use that term anymore, just because people are going to lump you in with, a perceived connotation that they have of what that term means.
Right.
But a lot of the things that we're seeing right now are validation of what conspiracy theorists have talked about for years.
Yeah, all this is like, it's almost like prophecies becoming true, or maybe since we have so much technology and so much open communication now that these things are just being discussed, there's no way to hide the truth now.
Right, right. And not only that, but, you know, it's what we were talking about before the show, and we mentioned it a little bit in the intro to this one. We are now at an age of awakening. I really feel that way. I feel like things are starting to ramp up. Art Bell called it the quickening.
Yes, he did.
Art Bell died shortly before all these things started to really take effect, you know.
And under mysterious circumstances like that.
Very much so. Very much so. And it's interesting how the past, these 77, 76 encounters link in with what we're seeing now and events that are happening now. You know, they don't directly coincide, but, in a few shows we're going to be talking about Hellier, season 2. Mm-hmm. And, well, actually they do kind of directly coincide. Hellier season 2 takes place largely in Somerset, Kentucky, right up the road from us.
Yes.
Which is just down the road from where these abductions took place.
Actually, yeah. It's right in the same, I mean, within 30-minute radius.
Right.
And there's a lot of things that happen within 30-minute radius of
the critters, Liberty, the Bigfoot sightings. I mean, all of these things take place right there. Last week when I was writing, the article for The Current about the Kentucky Werewolf, same thing. You know, we see these werewolf events, and when we initially take them as one-offs, we see them in a line of sight that says, okay, well, this occurred here, this occurred here, this occurred here. When you start putting these together, you realize that all of these things are happening right on top of each other, or within 30 to 20 minutes of each other.
Right. And then if you start looking, I mean, they all connect loosely with each other in some form or fashion.
Right. So, final thoughts on these events. What are your takeaways from the Stanford abductions, the Liberty abductions, and Lee Parish's abduction in Prospect?
I definitely 100% believe all their stories. The evidence is there. I feel like there are more people who has those. And if anybody who is listening who has had experiences, we would like to talk to you.
Of course, always.
You know,
Midnight in Kentucky could be in conversation with you.
I like that. And honestly, I feel like certain people who are drawn to these things, you know, as Hal Sparks said, he's always had an interest in these, and then, you know, there's a reason why people are drawn to them.
Totally, completely.
But not saying these ladies who were abducted in Stanford had an interest in UFOs.
Lee Parish did, though.
Exactly. And,
you know, that was another thing that I kind of forgot to mention in our breakdown of Lee Parish's abduction. His talk, or his mentioning of making that outside light turn on when it was unplugged, very similar to the rings thing, you know, of the Stanford abduction. Like, you never hear that part of the story, but that is pretty interesting to me.
Very much a trickster thing.
Right.
And I'm curious, you know, if we go back and look at the families of the ladies in Liberty, if maybe one of them, or possibly all of them, have some type of family connection to where this has happened to somebody in their family.
Or if it's still happening.
Right. If it's possibly still happening, and especially like Calvin Barker was abducted more than once.
Yeah, very much so. And, you know, I would say that all three of these women were abducted multiple times over the course of their lives. This is just the event that they really recall. Right.
And I think when this happens to people, I think maybe they, you know, like I said earlier, suppress the memory. And for some reason, sometimes maybe whatever is doing the abducting is not doing the suppression memory tactic.
Sure.
And then people end up having the missing time and remembering what's happened to them.
Or, you know, I like to think of it, maybe we are stronger beings than they give us credit for.
Yes.
Maybe we are stronger spiritually, mentally, psychologically than whatever this is that's doing this to us thinks we are. Maybe we are far more powerful than it thinks we are, and it makes us, it wants to make us think that we have no control over it. But really, we may have more control over these things than what we think we do, or what we're led to believe we do. Which kind of brings us to the whole perception thing. You know, Lee Parish says that he perceived it that these beings were interested in the way that Lee was being Lee. I thought that terminology was...
Yeah, it's almost like they were interested in his personality.
Yeah, or his consciousness. Yeah. You know, there's that old quote, all we are points of consciousness experiencing the universe as itself, right? So it sounds like in that experience, it was almost like whatever these things were interested in the way that Lee's consciousness was perceiving things.
Right.
And not only that, but in the Stanford abductions, you know, we see these things change the perception of these women. We see this road that was not there before open up and you know, take form in front of them, which I thought was a very interesting aspect of that.
Very much. And if you look at the area out there, it's the middle of nowhere. There's nothing like that there. So it's like there are no
straight stretches of roads like they described there.
No. It's almost like they're taken into another reality where that straight stretch of road exists.
Right. Or they're made to perceive that they're seeing that straight stretch of road when something, you know, altogether different may be happening.
Right.
And another part, and I don't know if you picked up on this, but in our Convention Encounters episode, we talked about talking with a lady at Crypticon who we believe had some pretty profound abduction experiences. I don't think she had awakened to that yet. No. I think she was on her way to realizing what had happened to her. But if you remember, she talks about directly after her husband had passed away, she saw her husband coming to her on a boat. Mm-hmm. And she felt like she was on water. Well, Lee Parish's description of this ship that he was on describes it moving back and forth like it's on water. A lot of these things occur around water.
And that's one thing I've been looking at. And you're right. A lot of these, whether a lake, a pond, a river, creek, anything, it's always around the water. Which, Kentucky, it's easy because there's a lot of creeks and rivers and stuff around
Sure,
there.
We're the second largest, or we're the second biggest spot for running water in
the United
States. But we're also a pretty big hotspot of paranormal activity.
Right. And it seems like line between the lakes.
Sure.
Even down this area, Lake Cumberland, you know, we've got stuff everywhere. The Ohio River, Kentucky River, Mississippi River out in western Kentucky, where there's all kinds of weird stuff going on.
Oh, yeah. And, you know, David Pilates mentions that water thing, too. In his missing 411 cases, he talks about how running water seems to contribute to these missing 411 cases. And here we are back at alien abductions. Yeah. You know.
That's very interesting. There's a lot of... seems to be a lot of things that happens around the water with these events.
And actually, messaging back and forth, Daniel and I, who we spoke to a few episodes ago, hoping to talk to again about some other experiences, he was saying that there are now lights out in Mintonville. People are reporting these very similar lights out in Mintonville. They say that the only time these lights don't come out is when it's raining. And, you know, I've heard many times that, and I'm sure, you know, listeners feel free to disprove me, because I would actually like to dig into this research a little bit, but I cannot recall a single UFO incident, or a single cryptid incident, or a single unexplained incident that has occurred when it's raining.
Yeah.
Other than Roswell. But we're not for sure what happened there. We're not for sure that craft come down when it was storming. It was storming the night before.
Right.
But we're not sure what happened. So there's something there with the rain. There's something there with it raining and nullifying whatever this is.
Like it cannot come out in the rain, whatever it is.
Which I hate to bring it up, but M. Night Shyamalan's Signs. If you remember, the aliens in that movie were allergic to the water.
That's true. Yeah.
So. Again, I want to highly recommend going back and listening to the Our Strange Skies episode on this case. That's Minisode 6, taken in Kentucky, the Abductions of Lee Parish and the Stanford 3. That episode offers a lot of really good information on this case, and Rob does a really great job of hitting the story highlights. So I'll include that in the show notes. Go give that a listen. That's going to do it for this rundown of the January Kentucky abductions for Midnight in Kentucky. Please feel free to join us on Facebook,
Twitter.
On the website, midnightkentucky.com. We are working on setting up a TeePublic, so hopefully you guys will have some merchandise to purchase from us soon, help the show out. Leave reviews for us on Apple iTunes. I think they call that Apple Podcast these days.
Yeah.
Change the name around.
They changed it up. Yeah.
Such as Apple. Leave us some reviews. Check us out on YouTube. A lot of cool stuff about to happen over there. Till the next moon rises, Nightowls. For Midnight Kentucky, I'm Ben.
I'm Steven.
Good night.
You've been listening to Midnight in Kentucky,
a Ransom Letter Publishing podcast.
Join us on Twitter and Facebook.
Or get in contact with your questions, comments, or stories of high strangeness
at midnightinkentuckypodcast@gmail.com.